Hey everyone, on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast, I've got Alemdar back on the show, and today we're going to be talking about advanced threat protection. Now, I know advanced threat protection, or ATP for short, is often a term that we see thrown around in the industry. We see it in marketing all over the place, but I don't think we've ever really stopped as an industry to stop and think about really what ATP is, why it's important, where it helps, how it helps. We're going to be talking about all that and more coming up on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Well, everyone, welcome back for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast, the podcast that brings you the knowledge and insights straight from the security lab here at Hornetsecurity. As always, I'm your host, Andy Sirwich, and with me, I've got Umut Alemdar today. How's it going, Umut?
Thanks for having me, Andy. I'm fine. How are you?
Doing good, doing good. Hey, just for those that may not be familiar with who you are, can you give us a quick introduction to yourself before we dive into advanced threat protection?
Sure. Just a brief introduction. I'm Umut Alemdar. I'm the head of security lab at Hornetsecurity. Because of that, I'm responsible for our threat detection products and also for our security operations team, meaning that I lead the team that analyze the emerging spam and phishing campaigns here at Hornetsecurity.
You're a busy guy, and I mean, I know that not just because, well, one, I report to you, but two, I also am aware of that just because security teams are busy, right? Especially when we're trying to keep our eye on, the current threats that are out there in the industry. It's always changing. There's never a dull moment in security, I would say. So, well, with that, when we talk about keeping up with security, that kind of ties in a little bit with our topic today, and that is advanced threat protection. So I always look at this topic through the lens of my early IT career, the early days in my IT career when we had... Basically, you put a firewall on the entry point of the network and you put AV on all the endpoints, and that was it. You called it good. And those kind of definition hash-based detection methods just don't cut it anymore, right? And that's why I wanted to bring you on and talk about this topic. And advanced threat protection is a topic that we hear about so often in the industry. Well, it's a term we hear about so often in the industry, and I don't feel like we as an industry do a really good job of explaining exactly what is advanced threat protection, right? You see it in all this marketing across a number of different vendors, and it sounds good, advanced threat protection, but I guess what I want to start with, Umut, is what exactly does it mean? So can you give us a definition of what advanced threat protection is for our listeners?
Sure. To understand what advanced threat protection is, we also need to keep in mind what the signature and hash-based methods are that you described. So signature and hash-based methods describe a measure that help against known signatures, right? So in order to tag or flag a signature or a hash, you need to know it. And ATP, so advanced threat protection, helps to detect, prevent, and respond to more sophisticated attacks, cyber threats that are not known yet or that can change over the course of a campaign. That is where ATP comes in. So in the context of email, ATP services scan incoming and also outgoing emails for malicious content. This can be phishing links, but also text. Most ATP solutions also use AI in order to analyze text for social engineering attacks. What I tell people to briefly describe what ATP is that it's targeted against sophisticated and newly emerging, never seen before cyber attacks.
That's probably the best way I've ever heard it described too, is because instead of, like you said, those signatures and hash-based detection methods where like, hey, this piece of email is coming through, because we're talking about this in the lens of through the lens of email, right? This piece of email comes through, and okay, I'm going to compare that with this list I have over here, and nope, it doesn't match with anything. Send it through, right? Which, advanced threat protection, kind of, it sounds like we're looking for strange behavioral things inside of the piece of content, right? So like you said, using AI to detect social engineering. social engineering can be a lot of things, right? And it's different social engineering targeted at different people. So I can definitely see where that AI comes into play to try to detect whether something is malicious or not. And I guess the other piece that you mentioned is, looking at new and emerging threats. New and emerging threats happen so frequently now that we can't possibly keep a signature database updated with any useful frequency today, right? And I think that's where ATP comes in as well too, based on what you said. So, all right. So yeah, we kind of talked about what it is briefly, but yeah, I think what would be interesting is if we kind of get into some exact scanning technique. So we kind of talked about what it is. I guess what are some of the common techniques that are used for scanning an ATP? So I know that I can look at our own ATP engine as an example here because I've presented on our ATP solution multiple times, and I know the one big talking point that I always bring up because it's right there on our slide is 500 plus detection methods, I think is how we have it worded, or scanning methods. I should know this because I present on it all the time, but the slide's not right in front of me, right? But can you kind of speak to what some of the common scanning techniques are and why it makes ATP better than your average scanning method?
Yeah, sure. Common scanning techniques, for example, are sandboxing. This is something that probably all of us heard at some point. Sandboxing describes the method when the machine executes files in a safe and isolated environment to observe suspicious activities, like maybe the file creates a new AutoStat entry under Windows, or the file manipulates some Windows registry keys, for example, to make sure that it's persistent within the Windows machine. The sandbox then classifies the suspicious activity accordingly to highlight if it's malicious or not. Besides that, ATP solutions often also come with time of click protection for scanning URLs. So regular spam filters and also threat detection measures scan URLs at the time of scanning, but time of click helps to scan the link when the user actually clicks on it. So in sophisticated phishing campaigns, we have observed that threat actors armed the link at some point later after delivery. So like 10 minutes, 15 minutes later.
Right.
So at the time of scanning the email, there was no phishing site or there was no malicious payload to be checked. But later when the user clicked on it, the user could then access it. So this is where ATP comes in to protect the user. A very important component for ATP is also the natural language understanding module. So this helps to detect social engineering attacks, CEO impersonation attacks also. So we've probably also all seen attacks that impersonate the CEO to make sure that the payment is going through or something like that. This is also that ATP can prevent.
I'm glad you bring that up because I've seen that back in my MSP days. I'm almost positive I've mentioned this in a previous episode. For those listeners, apologies if you heard the story already, but it was that stereotypical C-suite fraud, right? So the CFO of the MSP I was working for at the time gets an email from the CEO, or at least appears to be the CEO. Hey, we've got this urgent invoice. Please wire $70,000 to this bank account, essentially, is what it boiled down to, right? And there's always urgency with these messages, right? Thankfully, the CFO had, the foresight, and we had been talking with our staff enough about being aware of these types of threats. And this was before the days of security awareness services, right? So it was just what we communicated internally, but thankfully enough of it had stuck to where the CFO stopped and questioned it. But you hear all these stories about, one of our good friends and guest on the show, Matt Fry, actually had a story once where somebody impersonated an outside vendor that it was basically being paid for services by the target organization. And the threat actor posed as that outside vendor and said, hey, I need to update our payment details. This is the account you're going to wire the money to from now on, right? And they just kind of snuck in there under the hood. And I mean, this is that type of behavioral stuff that ATP is designed to catch, right? Because on its surface, again, looking at this from a signature and hash-based perspective, those types of messages look fine, right? There doesn't appear to be anything malicious when you're comparing it with a list, a database of known vulnerabilities. But that behavioral piece is so important, and I think that's the one thing that always hits home for me when we talk about ATP. So, so those are some basic scanning techniques. I want to get into sandboxing a little bit more. So, I mean, people always, they see this term and they wonder, okay, sandboxing, I have a general idea. So basically, we're taking that suspect piece of mail, in this case, again, through the lens of email, and we're pulling that into a isolated environment to kind of take it apart and look at it in a little bit more depth. I don't know if there's any more information you could share on that process, Umut, just a little bit.
Yeah, sure. The sandbox process describes the dynamic analysis process in malware analysis. So we need to differentiate between static and dynamic analysis. Static analysis means we basically dissect the file as is. So it's basically dead, and we check the corpse for hints for malicious indicators and so on. And in dynamic analysis, we execute the malware and check where the malware connects to. So which servers do we see connections to? Does the malware download anything from these servers? Does it execute it? Does it change any registry keys and so on? And when we think about ransomware, I mean, ransomware encrypts a lot of files locally.
Right.
The sandbox is also capable of detecting that. So does the file, when executed, change a lot of local files? So these are the behaviors that the sandbox looks for. And this also helps to detect zero-day attacks, right? In the past, we analyzed some malware campaigns that had zero detection rates at VirusTotal, for example. And we detected them nonetheless as malicious through behavioral analysis in the sandbox. So overall, the sandbox really helps against zero-day threats, but also zero-day-like threats. So if you don't have a signature, for example, for a malware, the sandbox is basically the last stop to stop it.
I really love the sandbox capabilities, because the way I always explain that, again, if I go back to my MSP days, I would always explain sandboxing to end users like, hey, you ever have a piece of email get delivered where you weren't sure, you think it could be malicious, but you were too afraid to click on the link? I'm like, we're using the sandbox to click that link for you, basically, is what it comes down to at the end of the day, right? And I really like our sandbox capabilities, so appreciate you kind of giving us a little more details there. So, we've talked about some scanning techniques. The other thing that we've mentioned a few times so far in our conversation, Umut, is the role of AI inside of this solution, right? And I mean, you think about how things are changing in the world today with AI. I mean, I could throw a dart and probably hit an article somewhere that talks about ChatGPT today, right? In fact, we did an episode with Yvonne Bernard not too long ago where we talked about using ChatGPT to make ransomware. I'll be sure to include that in the show notes for those that are interested. But AI, I think the security community has spent a lot of time talking about how AI can be used by threat actors, and I feel like we haven't spent enough time talking about how Blue Team can leverage AI, right? And I think that's what I really wanted to highlight here, is how AI is transforming ATP services. Can you speak to us a little bit about that point?
Sure. So we already mentioned the behavioral analysis of malware, for example, in the sandbox. Coming back to that example, AI helps us to basically track system activities to identify abnormal behavior within the Windows environment. So we know what good files may look like. So maybe a good PDF document, when you open it, it simply connects to a remote server, probably. Most likely not, because everything is involved in the PDF document. But malicious PDF documents may connect to a remote server to download scripts or malicious payload through the execution of JavaScript. So this would be an abnormal behavior that AI can help detect. Or maybe you execute a malicious Word document in the sandbox, and the document starts a macro that automatically downloads, again, malicious software from a remote server to execute it locally. The remote server then creates persistence within the system. This would then also be an abnormal behavior that AI can help us to detect the threat. In regards to CEO fraud, NLP, so natural language processing, natural language understanding, also belongs to the area of AI, helps us to highlight these CEO fraud attacks, social engineering attacks also. And beyond that, there are also other capabilities of AI that we included in our service portfolio, like email clustering, that helps us to detect emerging new phishing campaigns, for example, that we did not see. We check for abnormal behaviors. A very simple example would be we see one link or a very similar link in emails from many different email sources. So this is looking very fishy for us. Coming from a security operator point of view, we would then check the phishing campaign and put it under quarantine accordingly, unless the system took over for us already. So this goes into the area of anomaly detection.
Gotcha. So a lot of different areas where AI comes into play to help supplement the security services. One thing that you kind of mentioned and that stuck out to me was the natural language processing, and that would be useful for multiple languages, correct? I mean, the AI understands multiple languages, and the reason I bring that up is I've seen multiple vendors out there, and the one that always surprises me, and I'm going to pick on Microsoft here a little bit, and I'm going to put the disclaimer here that I love Microsoft products, don't get me wrong, but if you look at the SLAs for 365, they specifically say that the SLAs in terms of Exchange Online Protection only apply to English-speaking emails, right? And that always surprises me because it's like, okay, well, the whole world doesn't speak in the English language, right? So that's one thing that stuck out to me is when you mentioned natural language processing, and AI can really play a role there in and bringing the benefits of that to all languages across the world, right?
Exactly. I mean, as a user, there are already some openly available AI tools that we can use. For example, ChatGPT. And ChatGPT can also speak multiple languages. So our products are all language agnostic. We don't have any issues at all detecting more fraud schemes than those using the English language.
Right. And I think that's just such an important point. It's always surprised me that that's in their SLA, but anyway. All right. I guess one other area to get into before I move on to our next major talking point here is I always think an example provides a clearer picture of the benefit of a particular technology, right? When we look at the AI detection methods that we've talked about so far, is there a particular case that stands out that you can think of? I know we've given a couple of examples already, and maybe those cover it, but I don't know if there's something else that you wanted to touch on in terms of an example.
Just a day-to-day example. I mean, we see what our solutions put under quarantine, and the most common fraud scheme where AI helps us a lot spear phishing emails that impersonate CEOs. So the language processing modules really help a lot to detect social engineering attacks. For those viewers who are currently observing the podcast, is social engineering a CEO fraud email attack is very simple. So it usually contains 3 lines of text. For common spam filters, it's really hard to detect these texts because the text looks super legit.
Right.
And the system needs to understand the text. It needs to analyze the urgency of the text. So quite often it's written in a very urgent style because the CEO is currently on travel, for example, and needs to have his payment done ASAP. So things like this is where AI comes into play quite efficiently.
Yeah, you laid it out perfectly. You know, the CEO's traveling somewhere. There's this urgent matter, and I mean, and threat actors use this to their advantage. I mean, you talk to most rank and file workers, they see an email from the CEO asking them to do something. It's like, okay, I need to go do that right now. I better take care of it right now. I mean, it just creates this very real sense of urgency for most people, right? So that's a fantastic example. So one other area I want to make sure we get into before we kind of wrap up today's episode is QR codes, because I think this is an area that has become, I don't know if I want to say an emerging security concern, because QR codes have been around for a while now, right? But really starting to see an uptick in documented attacks using QR codes, right? And embedding QR codes in emails. So the example that I always think of is there is a I don't know how I explain the store. It's one of my favorite stores in the town I live in here in Michigan. They sell comics and video game stuff and Dungeons and Dragons stuff. I mean, just it's like a nerd store basically, right? Yes, I'm a nerd and I'm completely okay with that, in case anybody was wondering. But I'm on their mailing list, so I get an email from them on the regular, right? Like, hey, this is the new stuff we have this week, or whatever. Scan this QR code to see our our newest inventory, right? And now that I've been kind of in the security space, specifically for a while now, well, I mean, when you're in IT, you're kind of always one foot in security, right? But really focusing like on security here for a little while now. Now I look at that type of stuff and I'm just like, I don't know what URL is behind that. Like QR codes just feel icky now, just because like I know that there's threats occurring specifically from QR codes. And this really kind of ties into the advanced threat protection discussion, right? Umut, can you kind of talk about how ATP can help with this particular problem?
Sure. Just a fun fact before we go into the topic. I read the Bitly QR code index some minutes ago. It's from the previous year, and they reported that the QR code usage increased by over 200% compared to the previous year. And the leading industry sectors are the finance industry, followed by healthcare and government. So guess where ATP now comes in? Right. These industries are also quite often impersonated by phishers, fraudsters, and so on. And they know that QR codes are a quite convenient way for users to scan codes, to move to target websites and so on. Maybe they need to enter credentials also on these websites to log in. And quite often for the users, they simply scan a code and they don't check the target link, right? So we know there are security awareness trainings and services available that train the user to check the link, to check the target domain, and so on. And this is not applicable to QR codes. So it's a really dangerous method to obfuscate phishing links. And phishers also know that. They use these tricks to deliver their phishing links to their users, and emails also. Emails, this comes into play, for example, as I mentioned, in regards to the finance industry. Maybe they send around emails related to PIN resets or something like that, or password resets, but you need to scan the QR code with your mobile phone in order to do it. And our ATP comes into play that we are capable to actually analyze these QR codes. We are able to parse it, to process all of the content that has been codified more or less in these QR codes. And this helps us to look into a vector that is not quite commonly looked into. Because of that, we are capable of detecting threats that come in through QR codes and protect our users accordingly.
I think that's so important because, again, kind of looking at the industry holistically and just technology in general, I think about, like my parents, I can't tell you how many times I've sat down at a restaurant with them, and you see a lot of these new restaurants, right, with no physical menu anymore, right? And there's a QR code on the table or on the napkin holders, scan this to go look at your menu, right? And I mean, they're hugely convenient. No one's disputing that about QR codes. But I think what it's done as a society is it has taught users that QR codes are convenient and quote unquote safe, right? So now when they see a QR code show up inside of email, their first instinct is like, oh, hey, it's a QR code. That's easy, you know, like, and they just kind of assume that it's safe because they're so used to scanning them. And we've been trying to train our users to be aware of not clicking on, you know, suspicious looking links or not responding to suspicious looking emails. I feel like we're still struggling to get that message across with QR codes, right? And kind of embedding this inside of ATP kind of helps take care of that problem for them. So it's an interesting one for sure.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, and
well,
you mentioned it already, right? So in regards to QR codes, people use it quite often in restaurants right now. I mean, there's also the WeChat app that a lot of Chinese people use in order to scan QR codes. In India, this is also going around. So they use QR codes as primary method to pay. And I think this will be this will come over also to Europe at some point.
right.
People adapt it already. Also, as you mentioned, the States is probably more common than Europe at this point. Yeah, so we will see it in many areas. It will be quite common.
Definitely. I see a lot of similarities between this and OAuth applications in 365.
Oh, yeah.
You know, it's kind of the same thing because with OAuth applications, end users have just kind of been trained that, oh, hey, here's this nifty tool I can use to get my work done. I have to authorize it, right? And they've just gotten used to clicking yes, that looks fine. And malicious OAuth apps is a whole other podcast episode we'll have to get into at some point. But I feel like it's a very similar story with QR codes. We end users have just become accustomed to using them without question, which is a problem, right? But anyway, well, Umut, I think we're about out of time. This has been a great discussion. Really enjoy talking with you on this stuff as always. I feel like ATP is probably a deep enough topic to where we could do a part 2 on this at some point in the future. So I'm sure we'll have to have you back for another episode. So always good to have you, my friend. And then those of you watching, I appreciate you taking the time to tune into the show. If you found value in today's show, be sure to hit the like and subscribe button, depending on what platform you're using. Again, if you are watching this out on the web somewhere, we are available on all the major podcasting platforms, you know, Google Podcasts, if I can say the name, Apple Podcasts. We're out on Spotify. We're out on Amazon Music as well, if I remember correctly. So your platform of choice, you can go find us. If you have any other questions or need some more info on the company itself, Hornetsecurity.com is the website. And we've spent a lot of time talking about ATP, and we always talk about ATP through the lens of kind of our own product set. So I'll be sure to include a link to our ATP section of the website specifically in today's show notes as well. Other than that, we'll let you go. Appreciate you watching today's show. Stay safe out there. Have a good one.